San Diego tied up. Okay, excuse me. Tied up to the Navy Pier in San Diego. Just a minute, I'm having a few difficulties here. Just hold on. So welcome to the Doolittle Raid, an amazing story of undaunted courage. As we all know, on December 7th, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. There were 3,581 casualties as a result of that raid. 3 ships destroyed, 16 damaged, and fortunately no aircraft carriers. There was 169 aircraft destroyed, 159 damaged, and of all the Imperial Japanese Navy ships in the attack, only 1 survived World War II. And this is the famous quote from Admiral Yamamoto: "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." Well, on December 8th, we declared war against Japan in the famous speech by President Roosevelt, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Well, on December 21st of 1941, President Roosevelt gave the order, strike back at Japan at the earliest possible moment. And the Doolittle Raid concept is born. In 1941, the United States was in significant peril from both Japan and Germany. The Doolittle Raid is an historic attack using U.S. Air Force B-25B bombers launched from the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier Hornet. It was a surprise attack on the Japanese homeland, and they had 5 targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Osaka. There were 16 B-25 bombers, 80 Doolittle Raiders, 130 Raider support crew, and 10,000 Navy personnel of Task Force 16. The commander of the Raiders is Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, and there were 16 Army Air Force pilots. Of course, Jimmy Doolittle in the first group, and his target was North Tokyo. The second group to launch and attack Tokyo, in this case North Tokyo, included Hoover, Gray, and Holstrom. Later, after the raid, Gray was killed in action over Burma. Third group to launch was Jones, Hallmark, and Lawson in planes 5, 6, and 7. Their target was Central Tokyo, and Hallmark was executed by the Imperial Japanese Army firing squad. Lawson is also the author of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. Fourth group to attack Japan was groups 8, 9, and 10, York, Watson, and Joyce. York became a POW in Russia, and their target was South Central Tokyo. And the fifth group, targeting Japan, targeted Yokohama and Yokosuka Navy Base, Greening, Brower, McElroy, and Greening was a POW in Germany after his tour in the North African theater. And then the sixth group targeted Nagoya and Osaka. That would be Hilger, Smith, and Farrow. Smith was killed in the North African theater, and Farrow was executed by an Imperial Japanese Army firing squad. Now comes high praise from Admiral Halsey. In my opinion, the Doolittle flight was one of the most courageous deeds in all of military history. Well, on December 21st, President Roosevelt gives the order, and then on 3 February, Doolittle goes to Pendleton, Oregon, where the 17th Bomb Group had already been equipped with B-25 bombers, and recruits the 17th Bomb Group. They then subsequently were relocated on 9 February to Columbia, South Carolina, to attack the German U-boats on the East Coast. Then subsequent to that, on March 1st, the 17th Bomb Group is relocated for flight training to Eglin Field in Florida. And then on the 23rd of March, they were given orders by Jimmy Doolittle to practice their low-level flying from Eglin to San Francisco. And then on April the 2nd, and the transit to Japan began for a 4,500-mile trip across the ocean. And then finally, the attack was to be launched some 400 miles out to sea from Tokyo. Then there was a 1,200-mile escape route to the green dot that you see on the southern port of China, which was supposed to be a safe field, and then some 745 miles to the Chinese nationalists, where they would deliver 16 B-25 bombers for the Chinese nationalists to fight the Japanese who had occupied China. The Doolittle Raid is essentially an historic innovation because on December 22nd, when Roosevelt calls for the first Arcadia Conference between the United States and Britain, General Marshall, Arnold, and King represented the United States, and they were trying to plan Operation Torch, which was to attack Rommel in North Africa. Their task was to how to get bombers to North Africa, and Admiral King suggested that maybe the Navy could transport bombers with the Navy aircraft carriers to the North African theater. But right after that, General Arnold, knowing that he was given the task to attack Japan, said, well, we should look into launching bombers from carriers, and hence the innovation of the Doolittle Raid. There was the birth of an idea of launching aircraft bombers off of aircraft carriers. So in February of 1942, 100 miles off Norfolk, Virginia, they loaded 2 B-25 bombers on the USS Hornet to do some test flights to see if it was possible. It turned out Lieutenant John Fitzgerald at 1,327 hours was to fly his B-25 bomber off the carrier within a 500 feet launch distance. In fact, he launched in 300 feet, becomes the first flight of a bomber off of a carrier. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant James McCarthy did the same thing, launched within 300 feet, and the feasibility was a reality. However, there was a fatal launch hazard in launching off of the carriers, and you will see 2 white lines that the pilots need to line their nose wheel and their port wheel on, so that when they launched and approached the island of the carrier, that they would miss hitting the island. And in this case, the B-25 had approximately 6 feet clearance between the island and the starboard tip. So on 10 February in Columbia, South Carolina, Doolittle calls for volunteers, extremely hazardous mission, great value to the war effort. There were no details, but absolute secrecy was imposed. It turns out 100% of the 17th Bomb Group volunteered. That would be 70 officers and 130 listed. Now it's time for flight training at Eglin Air Force Base, and on March 1st, the 17th Bomb Group was relocated to Eglin Field, in those days known as Wagner Field. They were to go through a 3-week training course of short field carrier takeoff, low-level bombing, low-level flying, night flying, over water navigation, celestial navigation, and low-altitude bombing. Their training did not include any parachute practice jumps. And you can see here as Captain Hilger was conducting his low-level flying exercise at Eglin Field. Well, as it turned out, one of our pilots flew too low, and we lost one of the B-25 bombers. And oddly enough, the U.S. Navy instructor, Lieutenant Henry Miller, was a co-pilot of this plane. Well, the Doolittle brought on Lieutenant Hank Miller, a U.S. Navy flight instructor from Pensacola, Florida, to train the Army pilots. Miller was a Naval Academy graduate, experienced Navy carrier pilot, and an instructor at NAS Pensacola. He was to instruct them on short field takeoff. Well, the Air Force pilots are used to a long runway and a high-speed takeoff. But Miller's task was to train them to use a short runway in a low-speed takeoff mode. So training results started at level 1, where the pilots took off at 60 miles an hour with a 27,000-pound weight load within 500 feet. The next level shows the same distance, but at a lower speed of 50 miles an hour. And ultimately, Miller was able to train the pilots to take off within 350 feet at a 40-mile-an-hour airspeed with 31,000 pounds gross weight, which was actually 2,000 pounds over the design load for that aircraft. And you can see a picture here of the B-25 bomber making its takeoff within the 350 feet. Well, on March 23rd, it's time to execute the mission. So Doolittle instructs his pilots to conduct low-flying exercises from Eglin Field to Kelly Field to March Field in California and to McClellan up near San Francisco. This is an actual picture of those B-25 bombers conducting their low-level flying exercise on their way to California. And on April 1st, they loaded 16 B-25 bombers on the deck of the USS Hornet. And now it's time to transit. There was strict radio silence imposed, and the rendezvous was to cover 5,400 miles across the ocean in 16 days between San Francisco and Tokyo. There would be 2 legs. The first leg would be the Hornet from San Francisco to the rendezvous point, and the second leg was the Enterprise and Halsey from Pearl Harbor to a rendezvous point just north of Midway, and then 2,200 miles of Task Force 16 headed for Tokyo. This is a picture of the Hornet underway on April 2nd, coming under the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. This is a picture of how they loaded the B-25 bombers on the flight deck of the Hornet. The Hornet was captained by Captain March Michener, and Task Force 18 was composed of 4 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and 1 oiler, and of course, 16 B-25 bombers. On 4 April, Task Force 16 from Pearl Harbor got on her way to eventually head to the rendezvous point just north of Midway. Task Force 16 had the Enterprise CV-6, captained by George Murray, and Admiral Halsey on board as the commander of Task Force 16. 4 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and 1 oiler. Now, also on board, we had 4 Navy personnel and 1 doctor, Doc White, to brief the Doolittle Raiders on intelligence briefings, navigation refresher courses, first aid lectures by Doc White, and gunnery practice shooting at kites and carrier launch protocol. Well, as it turns out, on day 8, April 10th, Task Force 16 breaks radio silence, and the Japanese intel pick up the traffic. So Japan concludes there's going to be an attack from aircraft carriers with fighter aircraft of a range of 300 miles and most likely to attack on April 14th. Japan prepares, sets lines of picket boats at 700 miles. They load their long-range bombers with torpedoes. They alert their submarines, and they alert the first air fleet off of Formosa with the carriers Akagi, Soru, and Hiro. On day 11, April 13th, there's a rendezvous between the two task forces, which meld into one Task Force 16 headed to Japan, but they run into a very heavy storm with 30-foot waves. So on April 14th, there was no attack, and Japan assumes the U.S. is headed elsewhere, but Japan remains on the alert. As you can see, there's a 700-mile trawler picket line just outside Tokyo. Task Force 16 is experiencing gale force winds and heavy seas on their trip to attack Japan. Here's an example of some of the sea state that they were dealing with. And then on April 17th, Halsey has his 2 carriers and 4 cruisers refueled, and then sends the oilers and all the destroyers back to Pearl Harbor. And now Task Force 16 heads for an attack with 2 carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, and 4 cruisers. At the 700-mile point, Task Force 16 is detected by a picket boat, which sends an alert signal to Tokyo that there's a carrier force headed for Japan. Halsey issues orders to sink the trawler, which he does. And now Japan is ready for a strike tomorrow at 300 miles with carrier fighters with a combat range of 300 miles. However, the Raiders are going to launch today at 650 miles with B-25 bombers and a combat range of 1,800 miles. Well, this is where innovation pays off. Japan's in the dark as it relates to launching bombers off of aircraft carriers. So now the Raiders' task has been complicated because they're launching one day earlier and the Chinese rescue plans in doubt. The attack will occur at high noon and not at dawn as originally planned. There will be a nighttime arrival in the Chinese airstrips, and there will be 400 miles added to the fuel demand. So now it's time to launch aircraft in extremely bad weather. This is a picture of the pitch that the Hornet was experiencing, traveling at 20 knots, but heading into 30-foot seas and a 30-knot wind. So the Doolittle crew number 1 is the first one to launch. So Jimmy Doolittle pulls his pilot up to the launch signal officer, which you can see there on the right. He gives an approach's cost. You can see that he's got his nose wheels lined up on the white line, and he will have his port wheel lined up on the other white line. We've got 30-foot seas, 40-knot winds, and a pitching deck. And remember, we have a 6-foot wing clearance to keep in mind. So the wheels are lined up, the brakes are on, and they're full RPM. The takeoff must occur when the flight deck is on the rise in the heavy seas. So now the launch signal is given by the launch officer. They're at full throttle, they release the brakes, their flaps are down, and Jimmy Doolittle becomes the first ever to launch a B-25 bomber from the deck of an aircraft carrier. And now the launch is underway to conduct a surprise attack on Japan. This is an actual picture of Jimmy Doolittle launching off of the Hornet. Now, for the Raider pilots, this is an all or nothing mission, because as soon as the bomber is launched, Halsey's going to reverse course at flank speed to escape. The approach is made with low-level flying, and of course, it is a higher fuel consumption mode. But at 12 noon, the Raiders start their bombing run to their target. And at 12 noon, the Japanese homeland is under attack. The first attack occurs on Tokyo, right on Tokyo Bay. And the Raiders conduct a 13-plane swarm attack on Tokyo. This is the actual Army Air Force intel information from their after-action report of the various flight tracks of the 13 B-25 bombers which attacked Tokyo, Yokohama, and Yokosuka. Tokyo had protection from fighters, and they were also protected with heavy flak. So the first one in was Jimmy Doolittle, crew number 1. He flew solo. He approached at 1,100 feet at 200 miles. His target was North Tokyo, but he was immediately jumped by 9 Japanese fighters trying to take him out. He dropped his 4 incendiary bombs on North Tokyo with his 9 fighters in pursuit. He flew directly over the Imperial Palace, and he executed an S-turn escape maneuver through the Japanese pilots off course and then headed for China. The next group in was Gray, Hoover, and Holstrom. Their target was North Tokyo. They dropped incendiary and demolition bombs. In this case, Hoover got attacked and his gun turret jammed, so he had to drop his bombs and head for China. The next group in was Hallmark, Jones, and Lawson. They had targeted North Tokyo. Hallmark later was executed by the Imperial Japanese Army, and Jones, because of the North African campaign, became a POW of the Germans. And Lawson had his leg amputated by ditching into the South China Sea, and Doc White gave aid to Lawson after the attack. This was the attack by these 3, and they dropped incendiary and concussion bombs. The next group in was attack South Central Tokyo. Watson, York, and Joyce. York had to ditch to Russia after the attack because his carburetors were malfunctioning and he had low fuel. Their target was South Central Tokyo, and this is York, who dropped his bombs and then headed directly for Russia to be rescued. The 5th group in targeted Yokohama and the Yokosuka Naval Base, Brower, Greening, and McElroy. And Greening also was in the North African theater and became a POW of the Germans. And then the final group of Hilger, Smith, and Farrell targeted Nagoya and Osaka. And of this group, Smith was killed in action in North Africa, and Farrell was executed by the Imperial Japanese Army. At 1230 hours, mission accomplished. There was a surprise attack on the Japanese homeland, and now it's time for the Raiders to escape. On the escape route, Lieutenant Greening shot down 2 Japanese fighters. All the Raiders escaped safely from their raid on Japan. Joyce is the only one in crew 10 that was hit with flak, but there were no injuries. As you can see here, York escaped to Russia, and then we had 15 bombers traverse 1,200 miles to China, and were intent on landing at that little blue circle in South China and be rescued by the Chinese nationalists. So 15 aircraft head for China. They have a 1,200 mile trip, but as they get into their trip, they now the weather turns ugly with heavy rain. However, there was a 25-mile-an-hour tailwind that added 200 miles of range to the bombers. Well, that was very fortunate. Now at 8 o'clock in the evening at 2000 hours, the fuel tanks of all the B-25 bombers are near empty. And it's time to send a signal to the Chinese nationalists, which they did, but there was no response. No homing beacon, no secret Morse code. The rescue plan was to have Admiral Halsey send a signal to General Arnold in Washington, D.C. that the Raiders had been launched. And then General Arnold would send a signal to General Chiang Kai-shek that the rescue was on and that they should prepare to receive and rescue the Raiders. However, Halsey's escape required him to save our carriers at all costs. So Halsey went at flank speed in reverse toward the east to Pearl Harbor. He instituted strict radio silence, and he made the decision not to make the launch signal to General Arnold in his effort to save two of our carriers, which would be 40% of our carrier strength in the Pacific at that time. So General Chiang Kai-shek did not receive a signal. Now the China rescue is in doubt. So now it's the pilot decision time. Do we ditch in the China Sea or do we do a mountain bailout? 3 aircraft ditched in the China Sea, as you can see here off the coast. Didn't quite make it to the green dot, which was the safe landing strip. 12 aircraft bailed out, as you can see here. That is they were aiming to get to the green dot. And Okay, so now it's time to bail out at 45 hours, and Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle had to bail out over treacherous Chinese mountain territory like this. So it's a first-time bailout for all the rescuers except Doolittle. And in their bailout at night, all of the crew were dispersed among the mountains of China and were separated and were on their own to find their way to get rescued by the Chinese nationalists. And as you can see, they're well dispersed in this mountain territory, the last one being Jimmy Doolittle, way off to the left. And now the task of those that bail out was to avoid the capture by the Japanese army. This is the wreckage of the Doolittle aircraft. And then subsequent to that, at 2130 hours, the bailout of crew number 12, Brower's crew, produced an amazing feat by Sergeant Bither, who cheats disaster. So at 2100 hours, Sergeant Bither is the last man out to bail out of his aircraft. So his plane is out of fuel, it's descending, and Bither bails out into very mountainous territory. But now Sergeant Bither faces a disaster. While crawling forward from his nose in the flight deck, he was the bombardier, of all things, he hooked his parachute. It opened inside the plane. Now, Lady Luck has to shine on him tonight. So it turns out he did some quick thinking. There was no fuel, losing altitude. Sergeant Bither quickly repacks his parachute because he was the only Raider qualified to pack parachutes. Would you believe? He gets the Attaboy Award, the Bravo Zulu Award for cheating a disaster. Well, word spreads among the Chinese guerrillas. The Americans had made an attack on Japan and need help. Chinese nationalist guerrillas rescue 64 Doolittle Raiders, shipping them around in their wheeled carts, as you can see here. This is Jimmy Doolittle with his Chinese rescuers. They were crew number 1. This is crew number 13 with their Chinese rescuers. This is McElroy's flight. This is crew number 2, Hoover and his crew with their Chinese rescuers. Hilger was rescued, his crew 14. And if you look over to the right there, there's a cave, and that's where the nationalist Chinese hid the Doolittle Raiders until such time as they could safely bring them to a rescue point. This is a picture of Ted Lawson, who lost his left leg. And fortunately, we had a flight surgeon on board, crew number 15, Doc White, who was able to amputate his leg and save his life. The Doolittle Raiders, of the 80 Raiders, 73 survived. There were 7 casualties. 3 prisoners were executed by the Imperial Japanese Army. 3 were killed in action, and 1 prisoner died of malnutrition from inhumane conditions while a POW. On October 25th, 1942, 3 of the Raiders were executed by the Japanese. Sergeant Spat, Lieutenant of Crew 16, Lieutenant Farrell, the pilot of Crew 16, and Lieutenant Hallmark of Crew 6. The 3 Raiders were killed in action. Corporal Factor, Crew 3, Sergeant Fitzmaurice drowned when his craft ditched in South China Sea in Crew 6, and so did Sergeant Dieter, drowned because of the same ditch in South China Sea. 1 prisoner of war died of mistreatment. That was Lieutenant Meter, who was the navigator on Crew 6, and he's buried in Arlington's National Cemetery. Of 80 Raiders, 13 were prisoners. 5 of them were prisoners in Russia. 8 prisoners were captured by the Imperial Japanese Army. 3 were executed. 1 prisoner died of malnutrition, and 4 prisoners survived 3 years of inhumane conditions under the Japanese POW conditions. Here's a picture of the 4 Raiders that survived 3 years. Lieutenant Nielsen, the navigator of Crew 6, co-pilot of Crew 16, Lieutenant Height, Lieutenant Barr, the navigator of Crew number 16, and then the gunner, Sergeant DeShazer of number 16, who later, after World War II, returned to China as a missionary and spent the rest of his life in China. Of all the 16 aircraft, the crew aircraft number 6, 8, and 16 accounted for all of the casualties. After the raid, the Japanese Army took revenge on the Chinese and killed 250,000 Chinese in retaliation for assisting the raiders. They launched a massive gas attack. And the last Doolittle Raider reunion was on April 18th in 2013. And as they did in all of their reunions, they had a missing man formation of B-25 bombers. In 2014, President Obama awards the Congressional Gold Medal to all the Doolittle Raiders. And as you can see, fortunately, Dick Cole, the co-pilot for Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and crew number 1, was present for the ceremony. Conclusions and impact of the Doolittle Raid: it raised American morale, bringing the prospect of eventual American victory, even though no significant bombing damage was inflicted on Japan. However, there was panic in Tokyo and throughout Japan. There was widespread infliction of fear and uncertainty within the Japanese military establishment and the civilian population. The Japanese military was mortified that the emperor was at risk, and the military changed its strategic plan after the Doolittle Raid. For phase 2 of their Pacific War, they became defensive. They wanted to protect the homeland and the emperor from another U.S. carrier raid. So they established a defensive perimeter anchored by capturing Midway at one end of the defensive perimeter and the capture of Port Moresby at the other end. Yamamoto was insistent that they should attack and capture Midway first for their defensive perimeter. However, subsequently, during intensive debate among the Japanese military, Yamamoto reluctantly agrees to attack Port Moresby first. This becomes a gigantic strategic blunder for the Japanese. He commits his two newest carriers to the Battle of Coral Sea on 4 May 1942. The Shokaku was commissioned in August of 1941, and the Suzuikaku was commissioned in September of 1941. This is 1/3 of its entire mainline aircraft carriers. However, on 7 May 1942, in the Battle of Coral Sea, the Shokaku was struck with 3 1,000-pound bombs and was put out of action and returned to Japan. And the Suzuikaku itself had its air wing shattered and was put out of action and returned to Japan. Now, there are only 4 carriers available for the battle at Midway. Mission accomplished. Any questions?
Fantastic, John. That's the best presentation I've seen. So I'm going to open up. I know that Joe has a question.
Yeah, the first one was, were there other, how were the B-25s loaded onto the Hornet?
They had cranes on the pier that lifted them on board.
And were there other aircraft aboard the Hornet besides the B-25s?
Yes, the hangar deck was loaded with their fighter wing.
Okay, thank you.
And just a side comment, Halsey agreed that if they were detected and going to be attacked, they would launch all of the Raiders off the Hornet, provided they could either reach Japan or Pearl Harbor. Otherwise, they would kick the B-25 bombers overboard and bring up their air wing.
Open up to the group. Steve, you want to unmute? Anybody have questions?
Yes. Which of the defensive weapons did the bombers carry on board?
They had a gun turret, which really was not very reliable. It had a penchant for jamming, And then on the tail gun, they took that out because of weight. But interestingly enough, they painted a couple of broom handles and stuck them out the tail of the plane. And it actually served to kind of fool the Japanese fighters from approaching from a rear.
Other questions? What kind of